So this is the last week in our four-part series on the servant songs from Isaiah. We talked about gentleness and integrity and listening, and now we turn to the inevitability of suffering in the midst of being a servant leader. This excerpt is from a person called John Howell Loader, and it's a devotional reading out of a book called Bread and Wine. Jesus instructed his disciples simply and clearly not to resist evil and to love one's enemy in Matthew 5. He was not a foolish dreamer spinning out futile hopes for a better world, thinking that if only we keep smiling, everything will turn out all right, with our opponents turned into friends and our sacrifices all repaid. He knew full well the cost of such unlimited love. Such unflinching love for friend and foe alike will mean hostility and suffering for us as it did for him.
Today's reading is from Isaiah chapter 52, verses 13 through 53, verse 5. You will prosper, my servant. You will be raised up and highly exalted. Even as the crowds were appalled after seeing you, you were so disfigured as to no longer look human. So will the crowds be shocked at you, and rulers will stand speechless before you. For they will see something never told and witness something never heard. Who would have believed what we have just heard? When was the arm of Yahweh revealed in you? You grew up like a sapling before us, like a root in parched soil. You had no stately form or majesty to make us look at you. There was no beauty to attract us. You were rejected and despised by all. You know suffering intimately, and you are acquainted with sickness. When we saw you, we turned our faces away. We despised you and did not value you. Yet you bore our illnesses. You carried our suffering. We thought you were being punished, struck down by God, and brought low. But it was for our offenses that you were pierced, for our sins that you were crushed. Upon you lies a chastening that brings us wholeness, and through your wounds we are healed.
Would you pray with me? Spirit of God, as we listen to these words and we strive for understanding, a way to apply things to our lives and the ways we interact with others, be with us in our listening. Be with us in wisdom and in insight. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be filled with your grace and your peace. Amen. So, suffering is no fun to talk about, can I just say that? But it's a part of life, and it's part of the servant songs. This one especially has been called the suffering servant. And Jesus has very often been likened to Isaiah's suffering servant. And you can understand why if you listen to some of the words. But a few that I want to just lift back up that struck me are that even as the crowds were appalled after seeing you, it still says that rulers will stand speechless before you, for they will see something never told and witness something never heard. You were rejected and despised by all. You know suffering intimately. And yet, that person who was rejected and despised has the ears of the nations and has people paying attention and listening. Let me give you a little background on this section in Isaiah. So the book of Isaiah is huge. And scholars have broken it into three different parts, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah. So this is all out of 2nd Isaiah, or Deutero Isaiah, as the scholars call it. this part of Isaiah was written to the Jewish exiles who were returning from Babylon, returning from their exile. So if you remember, the Babylonians came in and wiped everything out, took control in about 386, killed tons of people, destroyed tons of property, and then they took the cream of the crop of the Jewish people and they said, but you have skills. We can use you, or you have prominence, or you have power. And so they took the cream of the crop of the Jewish people and they took them into exile in Babylon. Thinking they can help us with our construction. They took the doctors, they took the lawyers, they took anybody who could be useful, which makes sense. There, the people of Israel remained in exile for the next 50 years until the Persian Empire came in and conquered the Babylonian Empire. And we had a sort of decent King Cyrus who said, you know, all those people who are displaced from their homeland, all those refugees, if you will, all of those exiled folks, they can all go home now if they'd like. Which sounds great, but not quite so easy or as idyllic as it might sound. 50 years has passed. Think about the lifespan of people back. Okay, we're 2,800 years ago. All of those original people who were taken into exile in Babylon, probably not there anymore. So we're talking that second and third generation Israelites in exile who have never seen their ancestral homeland. They've only heard the stories of milk and honey and abundance. They've only heard the stories of the beautiful city of Jerusalem and how their temple is majestic, is the place where they go to worship and to know God, where earth and heaven met in their eyes. So those second and third generation, a lot of them went, oh, this is cool, we're going home. Never mind that it was 1,000 miles away on foot through semi-desert land. Worse than any of us going. I had to walk 5 miles to school uphill in the snow both directions, right? So they get there and they're weakened in numbers, in strength, in wealth. They're weakened in power, in identity, in spirit. And they walk into something that was not as it had been painted for them. They walk into a land that's almost a wasteland. And they walk into the city of Jerusalem that's still rubble. And a temple that's been torn down. And all of their hopes and dreams for the future are crushed. So here comes second Isaiah, who says we need something to try and lift these people up. These people who thought that once they could be a great nation again. These people who thought that they could have rulers looking toward them and they could, have land and wealth and power attached to them. No longer is that a viable option for the future. And so who will these Israelites be? And second Isaiah gives them a different role. Gives them a different vocation. And says you can still be a leader, but you will be a servant leader. And as a servant leader, you will still be a light to the nations and a light to the world. You will lead through your gentleness, through your patience and your compassion and your caring, your kindness and your respect of other people. You will be a leader through the strength of your integrity, standing up for social justice and doing what's right and being true to who God created you to be. You will be a servant leader by listening to others and trying to understand what they need and how to make this world a better place. And finally, second Isaiah says, your suffering, because I know it's been rough, your suffering will actually empower you. Yes, you have suffered with hostility and violence. You have suffered oppression and being outcast. But if you don't return hatred for hatred and violence for violence, you have the opportunity to transform this world. If you can absorb that into yourself and turn it around and give forth love and compassion and patience and kindness, there is the opportunity to create wholeness in the world. Because even though you are suffered and despised, leaders and nations will take note. Now, the footnote, okay? Nobody wants suffering. Nobody asks for it. Nobody says, hey, that sounds like a really good path. Let's do that. And God does not cause suffering. But in a world where the brokenness of our souls, our societies, our families kind of drowns out the voices of spirit, the voices of ego become very strong and cause a lot of suffering. Think about all the people we've talked about in the last 4 weeks. Can you name the people that we've lifted up as gentle, integrous, listening servant leaders? Who have we named? This is your test of the morning. Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks. Who else have we named? The Buddha, the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela. We even named Ellen DeGeneres, Malala, and probably a few others. Have any one of them been without suffering in their path? No. None of them asked for it. But those leaders that we hold in such high esteem suffered for their causes and for their truth. And Mother Teresa's come up next each week, and so I had to bring her up again. But this is a quote from Sister Francesca, who had Mother Teresa as a teacher when she was young. She said of Mother Teresa, she's an utterly selfless creature. She's extraordinary in her sacrifice. She can do anything for the love of God, endure any humiliation or suffering. She was always free of personal bias and did not hesitate to speak out when there was something wrong. You know, you just named a more recent example of Malala, who was 10 or 11 years old when she really began as an activist for girls' education. She started writing a blog for the BBC Urdu on what it was like to be a female student under the Taliban. It wasn't long after she started writing that she started doing interviews. And it wasn't long after that that a New York writer, journalist, picked her up and did a documentary on her, a New York Times documentary. Nelson Mandela even nominated her for the International Children's Peace Award. And then, at the age of 12, the ripe old age of 12, there was an assassination attempt on her life because this 12-year-old was a threat for speaking truth to power. Miraculously, she survived a shot to the head and has continued her work internationally to make sure that all people can have an education. Even without the suffering of dealing with a headshot, her family probably could never return to its homeland. And she has been the brunt of so much anger and hatred. Her name has been defiled. She has been ridiculed. There are conspiracy theories against her. You kind of go on and on. the suffering that she's had to endure, didn't ask for, but just to speak truth to power, just so little girls can have an education around the world. So maybe there's a little less violence and hatred. And then I think of Greta Thunberg, the teenager from Sweden, who, as a teenager, learned about climate change in her school and was so devastated by it that she sunk into a depression for months. She hardly spoke to anyone for months. She stopped eating to the point where they almost hospitalized her for malnutrition. And the malnutrition has stunted her growth at this point. Her parents didn't know what to do and how to make her better. So they started reading up on climate change, and so they started to realize that she was right. And so they started to change their own carbon footprint and not driving their car, not taking airplanes, planting a vegetable garden, not eating so much meat. And slowly she started to come out of this depression as she saw that even individuals could change and make a difference. And so she came to her parents and her teachers with a plan. She said, I'm going to do a school strike until the Swedish government agrees to all of the stipulations in the Paris Agreement. And at first they were not very pleased with this idea, as you can imagine. And Greta looked at them and said, well, you know, if adults don't give a damn about my future, why should I? And so slowly and reluctantly they agreed to let her go and strike the Swedish government. She was the only one there the first day with her sign. And then someone else joined her. And there were 2. And then there were 40. And then there were 100. And then there were thousands. Until across the globe, over 4 million students and people did a climate strike to try and save our planet. Greta has spoken at the United Nations. She's spoken in many, many, many venues. She was the Time Magazine 2019 Person of the Year, and it all sounds really good, but it was not without its cost. People have made fun of her. There have been online trolls that have made fun of her speech and her personality. There have been leaders of movements who have said that she was mentally unstable, who eventually took that back. There have been multiple leaders of government who have brushed her off or mocked her. The President of Brazil pretty much called her a little brat. And there have been multiple death threats against her family, so that now they often have to travel with security. But she hasn't given up the courage to keep going for all of these people that we've named. Is significant. Martin Luther King Jr. tells a story about, when they did the bus strikes way back when to try and raise awareness for the inequity between blacks and whites. He said he can remember all of the many, many ordinary people who walked to work and walked to school miles and miles instead of taking the bus. But the pride and the strength of integrity that they had, to endure that, even that suffering, had a purpose. And it struck a chord in their heart and their soul. Right? When we do the right thing, we know it deep down, even when it's hard. And so I know some of these examples seem like they're really, extreme, maybe, or people who are special. But they inspire me, and so I hope they inspire you to just do the right thing. Even though it's hard sometimes. None of us wants to suffer. None of us wants to be laughed at or ridiculed or outcast. But sometimes that's what happens when we're true to God inside of us. So, wrapping it all up. We're all called to be servant leaders, no matter where we are. And so may we all have gentleness with our partners, with our friends, with our families, with our coworkers, in our communities. May we treat people with honesty and kindness and respect. May we have the strength of personal integrity, standing up for what's right no matter how hard it is, and being true to the divine within us. May we listen, even when it's hard to listen. Listen for understanding, to bridge gaps, to create peace, to make a better world. And may we have the courage to accept and stay with it even when there's suffering involved. Because I'll tell you, we suffer because others are afraid of the power that we have when we work with gentleness and integrity, and when we listen to the voice of the Spirit and actually follow. Amen.